I know that it's difficult to believe, but we are less than a year away from the 2024 presidential election. Today is Tuesday, November 7th, 2023, and the election is on Tuesday, November 5th, 2024, which makes us 363 days away from that contest, which is not a lot of time, by the way. Now, of course, anyone who watches the news or opens the newspaper will see that we're focusing on very specific developments pertaining to this contest coming up. Of course, people have been talking a lot about Trump's legal battles. That's been on the cover of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal over the past few days. There's the third GOP presidential debate tomorrow in Miami, Florida. It's being hosted in part by my company, Salem Media Group. Shout out to us and be sure to watch that debate tomorrow. Of course, people have been talking about the Middle East calamity and how that might affect the Democrats or Republicans' chances of winning next year. And all of those things, of course, are things that we ought to be focusing on. I have discussed and will discuss each of those on this show. But today, for a moment, I would like to discuss a development that I don't see many people talking about. In fact, I'm not so sure that many people even notice or realize that this is happening. I have observed over the past few weeks, and especially over the past few days, that there seems to be a movement on the left that is trying to perhaps push President Biden out of office. Now, I know that that sounds ridiculous because why would you do that when this Democrat is in power? He's the incumbent president. A lot of people want to see him be the nominee in 2024. We know that. But again, there seems to be some indicators, not anything huge, they're subtle, that the left-wing apparatus, I'm talking about the media, I'm talking about think tanks, prominent politicians, may be hoping and wanting President Biden to not be the nominee in 2024. Really, this is because things aren't going too well for President Biden right now. Now, of course, that's been the case over the past 2 to 3 years. But this Israel calamity that happened a month ago today, I think has really changed things because it's the second war to happen under President Biden's time in office. The first one, of course, being Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And also, it has created this fracture within the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is pretty much through and through pro-Israel, but the Democratic Party, as we very well know, is really segregated and separated, mostly among age, between those who are pro-Israel and those who are certainly not pro-Israel. So I think that this October 7th massacre has really changed things. But even before that, anyone who's been paying attention knows that President Biden has been suffering from some serious challenges. Of course, there is the elephant in the room of his mental competency. People call it an age problem. Of course, age has made it worse, but there are a lot of people who are his age who are probably would be great to be in office. So really, this is a mental competency issue. The Democrats know that that is the case. The economy has been a source of trouble for President Biden. When President Trump left office, inflation was about at 1.5%. And then once President Biden took office, inflation went up to, at one point, between 8 and 9%. Now it's come down to about 6 to 7%. But still, that means over the past 3 years, the United States in general, although that rate has somewhat varied, have experienced ever rising prices. In turn, the Fed has raised interest rates to try to combat that. That has been a problem for the president. The border has been a massive problem. 7 million plus undocumented immigrants have come through the southern border since he was inaugurated in January of 2021. And it's been amazing to see that many blue states, many blue cities that once advertised themselves as sanctuary places for immigrants have come out and said, we are overrun. We cannot take this. New York City is one of them. Eric Adams, one of the president's most fervent supporters, came out and said that his immigration policies were, quote, destroying New York City. That has been a turn for the worse for the Democratic Party. Crime, another big issue that has been really as a result of Democratic policies that have certainly harmed President Biden, but he is the cause for the harm in large part because he has supported DAs and policies that have contributed to this crime. And then again, of course, as I said, there are these two wars that have gone on under his presidency. So I think the Democrats are now really facing the music and realizing, that's not a great track record. And this individual may not be as well positioned to win as we thought he would be. So I have about 5 examples that I would like to offer for your consideration of, again, signs that I sort of see that part of the Democrat establishment may be trying to push President Biden out. Right now it's gentle. Right now it's kind of subtle. But maybe if President Biden doesn't take the hint, it could be more of a shove as opposed to a tap on the shoulder. The first indicator comes from David Axelrod. David Axelrod, for those who don't know, was a chief strategist for President Obama's 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns. And then once President Obama was elected, Mr. Axelrod served as a senior advisor to the president. He's the guy on CNN all the time, to make it simple. And so he put out this tweet. And this was pretty amazing, by the way, because David Axelrod has been a supporter of President Biden. He put this out on November 5th, and he said of President Biden, if he continues to run, he will be the nominee of the Democratic Party. What he needs to decide is whether that is wise, whether it's in his best interests or the country's. Interesting. It's kind of a nudge, don't you think? And he's not outwardly saying that if President Biden were to run again or continue in this race, that he would only be doing it for his best interests. Posing it as a question kind of softens that message. But nevertheless, we can see the message here, which is that David Axelrod is trying to hint, at least, that this is not a good idea for President Biden to be the nominee. He was brought onto CNN, as he often is, to talk about this tweet in his remarks. He doubled down, but again, in sort of this subtle way, but nevertheless, he continued throwing out these hints. Let's listen to his comments.
You can see that in this poll. I mean, there's just a lot of concern about the age issue, and that is something that I think he needs to ponder. Just do a check and say, is this the right thing to do? But time is fleeting here, and this is probably the last moment for him to do that check, and it's probably good if he does.
See, again, he didn't walk back his tweet. He didn't walk back his comments. He didn't come out and say that he doesn't want President Biden to run. But throwing out those, again, hints is a big move for David Axelrod. And I'll just say, maybe this sounds kind of conspiratorial, but I think this is coming from President Obama. If David Axelrod is saying this, President Obama certainly knew and perhaps approved and even encouraged David Axelrod to throw out these hints. So that's, I guess, one indicator that this big senior advisor to Obama, this very respected, established guy in the Democratic Party, is throwing out these hints, saying maybe it's not such a good idea for President Biden to continue to run. Then there was the New York Times Siena poll, which came out this past weekend. Now, the results of the poll were very interesting, but I think what was more interesting is that the New York Times actually decided to publish it. And not only to publish it, but to reference it day after day. I mean, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, and today I read in the New York Times a reference to this Siena poll. We're looking here at one of the pictures of the poll, and it shows that President Trump is leading in 5 out of the 6 swing states that President Biden beat President Trump in 2020. Those swing states, again, that Biden beat Trump in, that Trump is allegedly, according to this poll, now leading, include Georgia, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Michigan. And we see there that the sixth state, Wisconsin, President Biden seems to be leading by 2 points. But A, that's a narrow margin. And B, that is the whitest state out of all of those 6 states. Now, why does that matter? Well, President Biden and the Democrats rely very much on the black vote. And if the only swing state out of those 6 that President Biden is leading is the primarily white swing state, well, it means that President Biden may be losing some of his support among the black community, which he so heavily relies on. So that was one poll. Again, it's just amazing, to me at least, that the New York Times came out with this and published this, because they hate President Trump and they don't want to give people reason to, I guess, be encouraged by President Trump unless they may want President Biden to not be the Democrat nominee. Let's look at another part of the Siena poll that the New York Times published. Again, this is compiling data from those 6 swing states, and it ranked how President Biden versus President Trump fare on certain issues: abortion, democracy, Israel-Palestine conflict, economy, national security, and immigration. And it shows that with abortion and democracy, President Biden is leading over President Trump as far as his favorability or approval in each of those 6 swing states. But then you look at the other 4 issues, and President Trump is leading. Again, he's leading on President Trump. That is the Israel-Palestine conflict, the economy, national security, and immigration. Now, we know that in presidential contests, the economy matters hugely. People tend to vote, especially with an incumbent president, on the economic state of the country. If they're happy with the economy, it's likely that they'll re-vote for the incumbent. If they're not happy with the economy, they may pick the alternative. So the New York Times knows this, and it's, again, kind of amazing that they are showing out to their readers, to their audience, that President Trump is doing much better than President Biden on that issue, among others. Okay, so we have the David Axelrod throwing out the hints. We've got the New York Times Siena poll, which doesn't make President Biden look too great. And then we have more coming from the New York Times about President Biden not being very complimentary of him, and in fact exposing that he may not be the best nominee. Of course, again, they don't say that explicitly, but that's what one, I think, takes away. So these are 2 articles that I, like a nerd, cut out in the New York Times this morning. My little apparatus is I physically cut out the articles and I file them away. So here's one. When I opened the New York Times this morning and saw this headline, I could not believe that they published it. Okay, so this morning, November 7th, 2023, here is the title of the article. Poll shows black voters upset with Democrats shifting towards Trump. Wow. Allow me to read a paragraph. New polls by the New York Times and Siena College found that 22% of black voters in 6 of the most important battleground states said that they would support former President Donald J. Trump in next year's election, and 71% said that they would back Mr. Biden. This drift in support is striking, given that Mr. Trump won just 8% of black voters nationally in 2020 and 6% in 2016. No Democratic presidential candidate since the civil rights era has earned less than 80% of the black vote. Wow. So again, I know I'm beating a dead horse, but the results of these polls are something to behold. But the fact that the New York Times is putting in a headline and reminding voters of the results of this poll, that is a development unto itself. And then here's the second article that was critical of President Biden that was published in the New York Times today. The headline is Biden faces limits of leverage in 2 wars. I'll just read to you the opening sentence. After 4 weeks of terror and retaliation in Israel and Gaza and 20 months of war in Ukraine, President Biden is confronting the limits of his leverage in the 2 international conflicts defining his presidency. Those last few words are amazing. They are admitting that these two international conflicts have defined President Biden's presidency. We often hear when supporters of President Biden talk about those two wars, Ukraine and Israel, they say, oh, well, it would have happened anyway, or, oh, it doesn't have to do with America, it doesn't have to do with President Biden. So again, pretty big acknowledgement that they're saying that it is true, that it has defined this man's time in office. And again, although it's not explicit, I think it's hinting that he has contributed to perhaps causing or at least making the conditions more hospitable for those wars to take place. Okay. So Axelrod, New York Times, what's another indicator of perhaps elements of the Democrat establishment gently trying to push President Biden out of office? Well, there's a new Democrat primary challenger as of a few days ago. Dean Phillips is a Democratic congressman from the state of Minnesota, and he just launched a primary challenge to President Biden within the Democratic Party. Let's listen to what he said in his campaign announcement.
My friends, it is time for a change, and I am ready to lead our great nation to a secure and a more prosperous future. I am the Democratic candidate who can win the 2024 election.
People are too smart in the Democratic Party to just take on President Biden head on. But to say we need a change and I can win is pretty close up to the line as you can get of saying that you disapprove of President Biden. You know, for an incumbent president to get a primary challenge in his own party is a huge slap in the face. Huge. I mean, President Biden already has primary challengers. Marianne Williamson is a Democrat challenging him. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I should say, was challenging President Biden within the Democratic Party up until very recently. He recently changed to run as an independent instead of a Democrat. But if we look at the past 100 years of American politics, we can see that when an incumbent president has a primary challenger, almost always it means that they will be defeated. Allow me to provide some examples. Gerald Ford was an incumbent president who had a primary challenger, Ronald Reagan, and he lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976. Jimmy Carter was an incumbent president who had a challenger, Ted Kennedy. He lost the presidency to Ronald Reagan in 1980. George H.W. Bush was an incumbent president who had a primary challenger in his own party, Pat Buchanan. He also had Ross Perot, who was an independent. And George H.W. Bush lost to Bill Clinton in 1992. See a pattern here? Of course, it doesn't mean that it's in the can. President Biden isn't going to win. But the fact that he has several primary challengers indicates that within his own party, in addition to among the American people at large, there is some pretty significant dissatisfaction. And then, of course, we have members of the party who are starting to come out and really just take President Biden on directly. And this, as I said, has especially proliferated in the past month since the October 7th pogrom in Israel. One such Democrat is Representative Rashida Tlaib. Now, she is very popular among younger Democratic voters. She's a member of the Squad alongside AOC and others. And she has talked about her anger at President Biden for how President Biden has supported Israel. Let's listen to what Representative Tlaib said this past weekend in a speech.
And to my president, to our president, yes, he's still on. Well, hold on. I want him to know, as a Palestinian American, as also somebody of Muslim faith, I'm not going to forget this. And I think a lot of people are not going to forget this.
Representative Tlaib on Friday posted another video, which was kind of a montage of clips of anti-Israel protests, as well as clips of President Biden voicing his support for Israel. And that video ended with a message: Joe Biden supported the genocide of the Palestinian people. Pretty big thing for her to, a pretty big accusation for her to levy against the president, the head of her own party. And as I said, there's huge divide among Democrats, really across ages, with regard to support for Israel. According to William McGurn in the Wall Street Journal, when Democrat polls were asked Democrats to rate how they liked Israel's response to the October 7th attack, Democrats disapproved of Israel's response 49% to 33%. But then if you looked at Democrats aged 24 to 34, they disapproved 52% to 32%. So if Representative Tlaib is going after President Biden, she is undoubtedly really kind of frothing up that cohort of people who are angry at Israel's response and in turn are probably angry at President Biden's response. And that is not a good thing to have happen 363 days before the election. We will see, President Biden, if the voters think that you can do it. I'll see you soon here on Julie Noted. Thanks so much for being here. Take care.